Welcome back to the Intimaphilian. I'm your host, Miranda Barnes, and this is a podcast where we discuss insect culture and some of the interesting ways they intersect. I'm excited to announce that in between the time when I recorded the first episode and the time I recorded this episode, I discovered that the mic I've been using picks up a lot more weird rustling noises than I thought, and also that my default tone of voice is getting a little more katydid than cricket, if you catch my drift. So I'm gonna try putting a little bit more air through my lungs in hopes that that solves the problem a little bit. But unfortunately, that is apparently just the way that I talk. But hopefully for this episode, any residual vocal fry will help set the tone. You know, like I'm telling you an exciting and spooky campfire story. Last time, we stepped a little out of my comfort zone by discussing a Russian opera, but today we'll be sticking a little closer to where I grew up. By which I mean, we are going to West Virginia and looking at its local folklore. Okay, to be completely honest with all of you, I technically grew up in Southwest Virginia. Sorry, Southwest Virginia. Like Southwest space Virginia, which is a pretty big distinction if you're from that neck of the woods. But I feel like I spent my fair share of time wandering around outside in the dark with my friends, waiting for spooky things to happen. Anyway, given the topic of this podcast and the terms West Virginia and folklore spoken in such quick succession, I'm sure that you've already guessed that this one is going to be about Mothman. Is it Mothman or is it the Mothman? I don't know which one I prefer, to be honest. Mothman sounds like it could be like your neighbor's last name. The is pulling a lot of weight and making it sound intimidating. For those of you who are not familiar with this particular story, the gist of things is that around 1966 and 1967, people kept recording sightings of this large winged creature with glowing red eyes flying around the McClintock Wildlife Area near Point Pleasant, West Virginia. For an explanation for this, I must turn to the ornithologists among us who theorize that it was probably an owl or possibly a rare for West Virginia sighting of a sandhill crane. Naturally, though, the press at the time kind of took it and ran with it. I think there are a few factors that have contributed to the staying power of Mothman as a cryptid. Firstly, around the end of 1967, this big suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, Ohio, collapsed in heavy traffic, killing 46 people. This had absolutely nothing to do with the Mothman. It came about because one of the big steel bars helping to hold the bridge up developed a fracture and broke under the strain. But the timing being so close to those Mason County bird monster sightings opened the door to all kinds of bizarre interpretations. Case in point, in 1975, this guy named John Keel published a book connecting the Mothman to the collapse, and also to aliens, just so you were aware of the kind of publication we're talking about here. And in 2002, that got turned into a movie starring Richard Gere, which, if anything, just cemented this thing's legacy. In the end, I'd say that Point Pleasant has overall turned this Mothman attention into a positive force, driving local tourism to the area. Although I think that the public opinion in Point Pleasant is maybe a little mixed on that, as one might expect. They've erected this big metal statue of Mothman downtown. They have a Mothman festival every year. They have a Mothman museum. I love this one quote from the executive director of the Mason County Conventions and Visitors Bureau, who says, quote, "I've never seen the Mothman, but I have seen Mothman money, and we all believe in that. Yes, buddy, get your cash." I think what fascinates me about the legend of the Mothman as an entomologist is how little most of the media surrounding the cryptid has to do with moths, which is naturally very disappointing to me. I mean, I guess if we're assuming the original Mothman sighting was actually a bird, it makes sense that we see so many depictions of the Mothman with feathers, but if we're doing a full rebrand from Mason County Bird Monster to Mothman, we need to go all in. No feathers. Those wings should be covered in itty-bitty scales. You know, those scales are actually what give butterfly and moth wings their color. That color could be different pigments in the scales, basically chemicals that absorb and reflect various colors, or it can come from the structure of the scale itself and how it scatters different wavelengths of light. Or sometimes it's a combination of both. So yeah, no feathers, no bat wings, oh my god, just scales. And for goodness sake, no teeth! Oh my god! When one of the iconic features of adult butterflies and moths is having a proboscis, I don't want to see any teeth in our Mothman rebrand. We can keep the six-pack on the statue, though. No complaints there. The other big problem I have with the Mothman is, why stop at one? You're telling me that there's only one Mothman kicking around? You would doom him to such a cruel and lonely fate? I think that the next big piece of Mothman media should go the classic horror movie sequel route. You know, the same monster from the first film, but just more of them. Except no copy and paste Mothman. Lepidoptera, the insect order that contains all of the butterflies and moths, is so diverse. We're spoiled for choice here. I'm thinking we need a full mini-series. Mothmen. Okay, so before I pitch this to you, I just want to lay out some ground rules. First off, no butterflies. What's the difference between a butterfly and a moth? Well, technically speaking, butterflies are moths. How does that work? Basically, butterflies are a monophyletic group called the Papilionoidea. Monophyletic is a fancy way of saying that they all share a common ancestor. They all descended from the same ancient insect, and no descendants of that ancient insect are left out. But if we were to try to separate out the moths as their own distinct group, we wouldn't have a monophyletic grouping anymore. In other words, the common ancestor of all moths is also the ancestor of all butterflies. So the moths would be paraphyletic. And we can't have that. That would be like having a big family reunion, but your cousins kick you out of the party for being too colorful and flying during the day and whatnot. You know, things we've all experienced. From a scientific perspective, this means losing information. We can learn a lot about butterflies by knowing that they're nested within this bigger lineage of moths. Anyway, I'm being a bit silly here, because moth is obviously a colloquial term and doesn't have to be governed by these taxonomic rules. I just like to be pedantic. And I'm going to do exactly what I just said not to do anyway, and kick butterflies out of the family reunion, because butterfly wings give me pixie or fairy energy, and we're talking about cryptids here. Spooky, night-flying critters only. Okay, without further ado, episode 1. I think we start out traditional here. You know, two young people sneaking out to the McClintock to do some premarital car making out, as rascals often do in horror movies. Maybe they've left their headlights on, and one of them makes a very strange and on-the-nose comment about the big chunks they've noticed getting taken out of the leaves of plants around town. And the other one is like, oh, don't worry about it. It's probably just spongy moth. They can be pretty aggressive invasive defoliators. And the original person is like, wait, we should totally worry about it because Mason County isn't in the spongy moth quarantine zone right now, and it's not one of the counties that the West Virginia Division of Forestry lists as being a zone with concentrated outbreaks. What if it's expanding its range? And the other one is like, yeah, babe, people who live where spongy moth has become established should really look around their property for egg masses on the stuff they keep outside, particularly if they're considering moving it from one place to another. That can help prevent the spread of spongy moth to new places. And then their partner is like, you're so hot when you talk about how to prevent the spread of invasive forest pests, and leans in for a kiss. But right before their lips touch again, bang, something hits their windshield. Enter Mothman number 1. I think that our first lead Mothman needs to be a member of this fraternity, the emperor and giant silk moth family. I say that we go for the Polyphemus moth, Anathrea polyphemus, which is this really big, beautiful native moth that can have a wingspan of up to almost half a foot. That's like the size of my hand, though obviously the Mothman version would be even bigger. He gets his name from the big eye spots on the back of his wings, a reference to the Cyclops in Homer's Odyssey, which is a little silly in my opinion because Cyclops have like one big eye and Polyphemus moths have 4 eye spots, 2 on the forewings and 2 on the hindwings, but you know, it still sounds cool, I guess. Anyway, this guy is big and fuzzy. Honestly, basically just the himbo of the Mothmen. He kind of smacks against the car because he's confused by the headlights while the people inside are screaming. This Mothman has a vestigial mouth and cannot scream. Actually, as a matter of fact, he also can't eat. He did all his eating as a caterpillar, and now he's using his big feathery antennae to sniff out the pheromones of a female moth. He can fly for miles, but he lives for less than a week as an adult, so he's got to move fast to find Bay. So he's not actually super interested in the kids in the car and takes off pretty much right away. End scene, end episode. It's a very short episode. Next episode, I think we open up where we left off. You know, we have our car, silhouetted figures inside. Glad to see that the shock of seeing Mothman has not frightened anyone off the rural makeout junket. But, it seems like this time the authorities have caught them in the act. And so a lone cop stalks up to their car to give those kids a stern talking to. Don't they know there's a Mothman in these woods? He walks up to the car to see what's happening, and we discover that it's not the young punks from before. It's the giant leopard Mothman, Hypercomp scribonia. He is a really striking little guy with these beautiful white spotted wings. These are tiger moths, family Euribidae, subfamily Arctiinae. A lot of these moths actually have ears, so maybe he should have heard the guy coming. Not on their heads, but kind of back behind the base of their hind wings. In normal tiger moths, these are most likely adaptations to avoid bats. Some of these moths even go on the offensive and produce these ultrasonic clicks to actively interfere with bat echolocation. Other species probably just do it to communicate that they're toxic and shouldn't be eaten. We don't know for sure if the giant leopard moth clicks or not, but I doubt our Mothman has to worry about bats all that much, given how large he is. I suspect that being able to hear probably just makes him kind of high-strung and paranoid. You know, not very socially well-adjusted, not good at parties. And so when he's caught by this cop, Mothman gets out of the car, he bends over, and he tries to scare away the intruder by, 1, showing off his bright blue butt, and 2, emitting this gross yellow fluid from special glands in his thorax. If I had to translate this to Mothman anatomy, we'll say probably from his back, like near where his shoulder blades are. According to the University of Florida featured creatures page for the giant leopard moth, this secretion is, quote, bitter tasting. This fun factoid is attributed to Mark Mino. Personal communication. I'm not sure I want to know how he knows that, but okay, my dude. Anyway, maybe that works well enough for deterring predators, but tragically for our Mothman, as a citizen of the great state of West Virginia, it just gets him thrown into jail for the night for public indecency. And, you know, I really feel for the guy, because I, too, relate to being the lame weirdo in the room, when, meanwhile, in episode 3, we have probably the suavest Mothman to ever do it. I'm talking about our fast-flying, fast-talking Pandora Sphinx Mothman, Eumorpha pandoras. I mean, these are just beautiful moths to begin with. All of these gorgeous green and brown and black and white stripes and spots. You know, when we were learning to spot ID this family, Sphingidae, in my undergraduate entomology classes, I remember learning them as the moths that look like fighter jets. And they do tend to have that look to them, particularly when they're at rest on a flat surface. Anyway, I was telling you about that poor, mouthless, polyphemus moth earlier, but this guy does not have that problem. He has a long proboscis that he needs to get nectar from long flowers. I shudder to think about the size of the flowers that this hypothetical man-sized moth is visiting, but whatever they are, good for them. This moth family actually acts as important pollinators for certain types of plants, particularly orchids, which sometimes even have special adaptations to help facilitate pollen transfer through these nimble little sphinx moths. Anyway, with all that said, pretty awesome, pretty agile Mothman. Maybe this can even be our paranormal romance entry, you know, our Edward Cullen of the Mothmen. This is the proboscis of a pollinator, Bella. But, I mean, if I'm being honest, a moth like that, he may be too self-assured to be so edgy. Anyway, so I think we've covered our bases here in terms of our big buff Mothmen, but I think we need to round out the ensemble here with a moth that's a little more subtle and weird. You know, the psychological horror element to balance out our more straightforward horror movie monster entries. For that, I propose our plume Mothman in the family Pterophoridae. He's just a skinny little guy, you know? He's got these really long legs and wings. He's not really the type of Mothman to jump out at you. Like, our protagonists are walking into him, not vice versa. Maybe they're wandering out in the woods with a big old-fashioned flashlight looking for the other Mothmen, and they swing the beam across the trees and see him just staring, holding his wings out just completely perpendicular to his body. At first glance, they just assume it's some loser T-posing in the middle of the woods. But then they realize, oh no, it's another one of the Mothmen. And at that point he's been startled, and his wings snap out, and oh my god, it's not just the one pair of wings, it's 5, and a bunch of them don't even look like wings. They're just these weird feathery things. Wait, no, it can't be! The return of Mothman with feathers? What is this? How does he fly? And those thoughts will haunt those poor innocent strangers until the day they die. But actually, seriously, the plume moths do all have these bizarre feather-like wings. And they don't actually have more than 2 pairs. It's just that they're really deeply lobed. But still a very weird, very cool moth morphology. And not actually threatening when you see it in real life and they're like, not that big. Anyway, if Mothman can be creepy, he should also be able to be cute. Next episode, this one starts out with someone working in their garden, and they're kind of upset because they're growing all this rosemary to cook with, but something has clearly been chowing down on it. It's covered in all this weird webbing and frass. That's insect poop. So they're going online, looking up extension publications for what might be the problem, when they hear a little tapping at the door to their back porch. And they walk down the hall to see what's making the sound, when they see him. Just a teeny tiny southern purple mint mothman, Pyraus stellatoclavia. And he's got these eyes that are just cartoonishly big relative to the rest of his head, and no, wait, does he have a snoot? No, those are just his labial palps, but it doesn't change the fact that he is adorable, and obviously they need to let him in because he is clearly a very good boy, even if he did leave his excrement all over the rosemary. Speaking of boys, I've been talking about adult moths, but I think perhaps the only thing more terrifying than the Mothman is the caterpillar boy. Like episode, I don't actually remember what number we're on, but I think we need to take a look at the spiny oak slug moth, Euclea delphinii, family Limicodidae. Already, the caterpillars are some of the wackiest looking things you've ever seen. Green and orange and red with these sort of weird spined fleshy protuberances coming off of them. So cool. But I don't want to imagine them with human parts. Truly a boundary that should never be crossed. Anyway, in this episode, they find the caterpillar boy, and, harkening back to our original Mothman lore, they're immediately convinced that it's an alien. In classic horror movie fashion, of course, the feds come in and they're prodding at it, and it doesn't help that they find out when they touch the caterpillar, it stings them. That's right, this caterpillar has urticating hairs, which are these specialized defensive structures meant to deter predators. There are actually a couple of different forms these take in different insects and spiders. Some are true seedy, essentially hairs sitting on a stalk or in a socket detach easily from the caterpillar's surface. Tussock moth caterpillars have these, if you're familiar with those. There are also modified seedy, where the hair is contiguous with the rest of the exoskeleton and connected to other specialized cells, sometimes producing secretions that help enhance their protective function. Spongy moth caterpillars provide a good example of this type. The third type is spines, which are the most complex of the set. They're generally bigger, they're genuine projections of the exoskeleton rather than just being a hair that kind of fused with the surface, and they have nerve cells so that the insect can also perceive tactile cues through them. When the tops of this type break off, they essentially inject the chemicals straight into the skin of the attacking animal. In Limicodidae, we actually have both the second type and the third type, so all kinds of unpleasantness for the unfortunate person who decides that these guys just need a little pet on the noggin. Anyway, the feds find this caterpillar, and it pupates, but when it emerges as a Mothman, it's actually very fashion-forward. He's fluffy, he's got these fuzzy little booties and green spots on his wings. In other words, he's styling. Probably the type of guy who shows you his yearbook photos and is like, LOL, can you believe I looked like that back in the day? It's kind of like in those old high school movies where the nerd gives the jock an allergic reaction with their poisonous urticating hairs, but when they take off their glasses, it turns out that they're actually super beautiful. While we're on the topic of larvae, I think we should also address the humble bagworm Mothman, family Psychidae. You may not have seen the adult moths in this particular group, but you've probably seen the little sacks of plant debris hanging off plants, and well, actually where I feel like I tend to notice them is when they're hanging off of fences, just because that's kind of when they tend to be out in the open. But if you ever wondered what those were, now you know. They're super cool. I reared one out once on Spanish moss in a little vial in my apartment, and it was amazing to see the little larvae in his sack scooting around in the container. So cute. But obviously, if this is a Mothman, it's probably like person-sized. I imagine at this point in the show, it's become clear that the Mothmen are at least kind of sentient, so there's kind of a question about cutting it open. You know, our protagonists are like, no, you can't. There could be a caterpillar boy in there. And meanwhile, he's just shuffling around like a kid with a blanket over his head, never speaks, until one day, he just stops moving. The townsfolk set up chairs and just sit with him for a while, hoping that one day, a Mothman will emerge. But the thing about bagworms is that only the males actually ever leave the bags. The females never come out. They basically have no real appendages. No wings, no functional legs, nothing. So they just sit and wait until the males come to mate with them, and then they die in the bag with their eggs. So this episode ends on an open question. Will we ever know for certain what was inside that case? Will a Mothman ever come out? It's a mystery that may never be solved. Of course, seeing Mothmen like this raises real questions about other Mothmen and how they pupate. I mean, let's take the red-banded leaf roller Mothman, Agriatena vilitana, family Tortricidae. You know, he's probably not the biggest Mothman because they're not big moths, but I imagine he's still, like, person-sized. I imagine our protagonists are like, wait a minute, you're a tortricid moth. You make yourself a little leaf shelter for protection before you pupate. Where the heck did you find a leaf big enough? And our dude just puts a finger to his lips, or his proboscis, I guess, since I am taking a hard line when it comes to lips and teeth, and it's never explained again. Now, we've just gone through a lot of different Mothmen with a wide variety of lifestyles, and I think in a world where we have such a diverse array of Mothmen, it's only natural that we would have a few cases of mistaken identity. As I said, at this point in the story, we're pretty accustomed to the presence and the idea of Mothmen, but now we're getting new reports in Point Pleasant, a terrifying new creature on the loose, the Wasp Man. Now, that's not a reason to be afraid necessarily. Maybe I'll do an episode redeeming wasps at some point, but you have to admit that Wasp Man is a lot more intimidating sounding than Mothman, and people are understandably freaked out. But then, the dogwood borer Mothman, Syntheton Setula, shows up at the office of the local newspaper, and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for the confusion. I'm pretty sure that's me. I'm the Wasp Man. It's just that I have black and yellow stripes and clear wings, and that gives people the wrong idea. I mean, that's kind of the point because it helps me avoid predators, but, you know, nothing to be afraid of, says a giant anthropomorphic moth creature, but, you know. Anyway, I think this probably goes both ways. So in the same episode, we have someone driving along the road at night near the river, and they see a massive figure swoop through their headlights, and they stop, and they point, and they go, whoa, look, it's the Mothman. And then the figure swoops back around and lands in front of them and goes, okay, look, I understand the confusion, but I'm actually the caddisfly man. That's like a completely different order than Lepidoptera. And can't you see that I have wings with hairs rather than scaled wings like moths do? And my larvae are case-building aquatic insects. Honestly, people these days. And I guess the driver could be offended, but to be completely honest, they're just relieved that whatever the heck this guy is, he doesn't have feathers, and he does not have teeth. So what is the threat? What is the central antagonist of this miniseries, if not any of the actual Mothmen? I mean, it is true that the caterpillars of butterflies and moths can be destructive to certain plants, including important agricultural commodities, but they also play an important ecological role in their communities. Some of them are pollinators. So many creatures up on the food chain rely on them for food. And spotting one out in the wild or paying you a visit on your porch at night is always a treat. They're really just some of the most beautiful and charismatic insects that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And let's be clear, we could pick a lot of challenges that moths are facing. Kind of like with the bumblebees in our last episode, probably one of the biggest of these is habitat loss. Caterpillars need plants to eat, and if those plants aren't growing where they used to, thanks to land use change or changing conditions associated with a changing climate, or because nitrogen input into the environment has increased and disrupted previously low nutrient ecosystems. But regardless, if their larval host plants aren't available, moths aren't going to be either. And I should also emphasize here that the impacts are not uniform on all moths. A lot of the generalist, opportunistic species that cause us big problems in agriculture are going to be just fine. But moths that specialize on particular plants, moths that only undergo a single generation in a year, moths that don't move very far in a season or only fly for a short period of time, they tend to be under threat. We actually also see in a lot of these studies that the bigger the moth, the more likely it is to be in decline. And I mean, look at Mothman. His range is limited to Point Pleasant, and he's bigger than any real moth could ever physically be. He's in huge trouble. But for this podcast episode, I want to go all the way back to the beginning, actually, and think about our first encounter with Polyphemus Mothman. What brought him to the car? Light. I'm sure it's not new to anyone here that moths often tend to congregate around light sources. There have been a lot of hypotheses for why moths seem to come to light. People have said that they're drawn to it based on an instinct to fly out of cavities. You know, kind of like, it's the light at the end of the tunnel, I need to go for it. Or maybe it's because they're attracted to the heat, because they're navigating by the moon, that they're blinded by artificial lights. But current research actually suggests that it's really that they have this general instinct to orient themselves so that their backs are facing the brightest part of their field of vision. Basically, if there were no lights, the night sky. So when they're flying around lights, they're confused because they're trying to adjust their trajectory so that they're perpendicular to the light source. Though as a caveat, we don't necessarily observe the situation in all moths, so generalizing a little bit here. Predators like bats will even come to hunt around bright nighttime lights, and spiders will build their webs near them because there are so many confused moths there for the taking. So obviously light at night can pose challenges to moths trying to get around. What's maybe more important, though, is that some moths actually regulate their activity based on the level of brightness. Makes sense, since most of them are nocturnal. Some moths who inadvertently fly into bright places receive cues to reduce their activity, which could naturally prevent them from getting the stuff they need to done at night, from pheromone production to feeding in the moths that do it, to mating, to terrorizing civilians of a small West Virginia town. The usual, you know. I mean, but it makes sense. Even we humans can have our circadian rhythms disrupted when we expose ourselves to light at inopportune times. I am looking at you. Phone in bed at 3 a.m. undergrads. But some of these impacts go beyond daily patterns of activity. Some moths get cues for when to go into diapause, you know, sort of like a period of dormancy, particularly like around wintertime, based on day length. And the ability for some species to sense this accurately can be reduced by artificial light. And it turns out that in some cases, these lights not only affect the timing of seasonal activities of moths, but also the seasonal activities of some of their plant hosts. And remember, for some of these moths, if they're not 100% lined up with their plant host in the right state, at the right time, in the right place, they're not going to make it. I want to give another caveat here that the impacts of light pollution on moths vary a lot between different species, and that sometimes it's hard to do these studies in ways that test the effects of artificial light independently from other potentially adverse conditions associated with urbanization. So, although there is evidence to suggest that these lights have a negative impact on moth physiology, the actual ecological implications are sometimes difficult to assess. And so some of the solutions are still somewhat unclear because we need more research into how light influences moth populations in the field. But there are some things we can do generally to address some of these impacts. The obvious solution is just not to have lights on at night, but that's kind of a hard sell because we're also pretty active at night and we're not really adapted to see in the dark. Or more importantly, drive in the dark. And having lights around makes us feel safer. Whether it actually helps to reduce crime seems somewhat controversial depending on who you're talking to and probably also the situation that we're talking about and the way that different studies are structured. So I'm not going to wade into that here because that's not my area of expertise. But at the very least, it's clear the way that our society is currently operating, we need at least some light at night. Unfortunately, just reducing the timing that we have lights on at night, for example, turning off all the lights after it's late and relatively few people are active, probably is not a great solution overall ecologically, because the time before and after sunrise and sunset is kind of the major time nocturnal animals are out there doing their thing. And also big times when people want to be out there doing their thing with artificial lights to see by. One suggestion has been to alter the design and placement of lights to reduce the intensity or amount of light that's being projected horizontally out across the landscape or upward towards the sky. This could be at the level of the light itself, installing shields to ensure that most of the light is directed downward, or it could be in the landscapes around the light, such as minimizing the number of items that light can reflect off of. Other people have investigated changing the spectrum of light emitted, since a lot of organisms, including moths, have different visual ranges than we do and are therefore more sensitive to wavelengths like UV. So, more generally, to preserve a wide diversity of moths and Mothmen for future generations, consider how you're lighting your homes, and beyond that, think about how lights are being used in your community. The first step of figuring out how to make compromises between our societal needs and the needs of moths and other night creatures is to become aware of the contexts in which we're relying on light and the extent to which we can implement some of the modifications I just discussed without compromising safety. More research, more awareness, more moth, and maybe, just maybe, more Mothmen. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's extremely late because finding time in a quiet place to record is a bit tricky as a graduate student living with 3 other people. Next episode, noise pollution? Just kidding, not really. It's gonna be state insects, and it's probably gonna be up at the same time as this episode because I got delayed. So a special double episode 2-parter. Yeah, we're learning as we go here. If you liked it, please tell all of your friends and none of my employers. If you didn't like it, please keep it to yourself. My ego cannot handle the hit. That's it. Goodbye.